Being a CISO is like waging a never-ending chess game against players you don't know, can't see, and attack without warning. On this podcast, cybersecurity experts have a pragmatic dialogue on cyber risk, current attacks, and security trends. Welcome to the CISO's Gambit.
Welcome to the CISO Gambit podcast. Today, I have the pleasure in this episode joining me, Casper. Now, Casper is our Vice President and Head of EMEA Government Partnerships at Zscaler here, and has just recently joined us in August. Now, Casper has led and had leadership roles prior to joining Zscaler. And just to name a few, the Danish Chamber of Commerce. He also led the political affairs for Microsoft in Europe, and actually has been 3 times now the ambassador of Denmark. Now, I heard also that you were the very first ambassador to tech industry, actually in Silicon Valley. Very interesting. And also, I've heard that you've worked at many different conflict areas, for example, in the Balkans, Africa, and Afghanistan. So welcome, Casper.
Well, thanks very much. It's great to be here. So thanks, Tony, for inviting me on the podcast.
So, look, my first sort of question for you today is it's fascinating looking at your background and the number of different roles you've had here and the experience and that you can bring today. So, I'm curious, how did you end up at Zscaler?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I don't know whether I should give you the honest answer or a slightly better story. But I mean, when you mentioned, some of the areas I've been working in the past, it's not because I've been in conflict areas, I think, although we are, of course, involved in developing technology that is going to protect us against sort of malign threats from the outside world. The honest answer is that I was at the World Economic Forum in Davos back in January this year. And as it is with these kind of events, you bump into a number of people, and I bumped into an old friend from the days in Silicon Valley. He was working at another company back then, but he had recently moved over to Zscaler, and we had in the past spoken to each other about the possibility of working together. And a long story short, that basically led us to having a couple of conversations, and then a ton of interviews afterwards before they were unwise enough to let me into Zscaler. And as you said, I've been here now a couple of months, and it's great to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. Now, so I really want to start off and talk a little bit about what we're seeing out there. And, Zscaler, we're obviously doing a lot of reporting. We see a lot of traffic. So we have a pretty good view of what is the state of the internet. What are the threat actors doing? But more importantly, what organizations are actually affected? And of course, there's not many people out there that don't know and haven't heard about ransomware. And generally, ransomware has been hitting, the manufacturing companies and these types of companies. But we've often seen an increase towards governments and education and healthcare. So it's really hitting those sorts of public sectors. And I know that you're working a lot in this area. So the question is, do you think that these industries and the governments and, especially healthcare and these, do you think they're lagging behind? Or what do you think is driving this?
So I think the unpleasant answer more generally to your question is I think everybody is lagging behind to some extent. And I think if you look both at the threat intelligence that we provide in Zscaler, but also what other companies, what governments, what international organizations are putting out there right now, it fundamentally paints the same picture, which is, malign attacks on private companies, on public sector, on civil society organizations, even against hospitals, healthcare providers, that is increasing these years. And of course, now we have not too far away from where you and I live in Copenhagen. I think we can say that, although you come from a country far, far away from here, but we somehow convinced you to come and live here rather than staying in New Zealand. Yeah. I think that the problem is with the war in Ukraine that has taken that threat level up a notch as well. So what we see now is genuinely a really hybrid threat environment where even those countries that are fortunate enough not to have a physical threat towards their traditional sovereignty, they're seeing a lot of violations of their sovereignty in terms of cyber attacks, ransomware attacks, attacks against the private sector trying to get access to sensitive data sets. So I think the unfortunate answer, which is a long one, is nobody is doing enough in this area. But I think you're also right in saying that governments or the public sector in general are perhaps in general lacking a little bit behind. Although I do want to put a caveat in here that if you look at the European Union, I think among the 27 member states, there are big differences in the maturity in how to address and mitigate some of the threats coming in our direction. But I think the fundamental answer is we need to do a lot more. And I think both for governments, they need to look very carefully at how to protect the institutions, data sets, etc. But also in the private sector, including what we do in Zscaler, I think we have to work really hard to provide sort of state-of-the-art technology that can help mitigate the threats that I think will be with us for a very long time.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember very vividly, just recently getting the email that says we need to prepare, not from a cyber point of view, but physically, right?
Yeah.
To make sure we have water, food, and these sorts of things, right? But we're really talking about that the difference between the physical and the digital world, right? They are intertwined today, so there's no real separation here. And yeah. Of course.
And I think actually, Tony, if I can just sort of use a small anecdote from my own life. Back in 2017, I was ambassador to Indonesia, so living in Jakarta. And I remember very clearly the 27th of June, not only because it's my birthday, but also because this was where the NotPetya attack hit one of the very large companies here in Denmark. Maersk, sort of a logistical company or a shipping company, and I still remember how it basically wiped out their infrastructure. And the local colleagues in Southeast Asia calling us and saying, hey, can you help us get permissions to unload containers in the harbor, because we actually don't know what's inside the containers right now. So I think that was really a wake-up call for a very big corporation in Europe. And I think one of the problems with the kind of situation we're facing right now, and I would love your views on that as well, is, do we unfortunately need to have a sort of a Titanic moment, a very unpleasant experience before we put the resources in there that are necessary to mitigate the threats that we're seeing? I think there's a little bit of truth in that. You need a bad experience before you really take things seriously. And I think what we need to do is to make sure that organizations in general invest in this before they have an unpleasant experience.
Yeah. Hey, and it's so interesting you talk about that date, because that date is also, and now I know your birthday, which is great. I won't forget that. Yeah. But that date also sticks in my mind, because actually a month before that there was WannaCry, another large scale attack. Now it didn't have the devastation of NotPetya, but what's so surprising about that is that I was already on my own zero trust journey, right? So I was already, removing the attack surface, and I was already thinking about, what if one device gets compromised? How does it affect the entire organization? So I was very much lucky to be in a situation when that happened.
Yeah.
That we didn't have that risk in the corporation that I was working for. And we were actually a supplier to that, to Maersk. And I remember it very vividly, because we were so concerned. Now, what about us? What about all the other companies? But it's interesting when I look back to that point, and I'd love to get your view on this. Like, I said, did we really learn, right? Did we really learn from that event? And did we take the right steps to actually mature, reduce the attack surface? Because, we work with a lot of organizations, but I still sometimes feel like it's hard work and it's slow moving, right?
Exactly. Sorry, go ahead.
So sorry, what do you think on that?
So I think, and you are much more knowledgeable than I am in this area. I am, after all, just a politico who found myself, somehow ending up in the technology sector. But I think what was crystal clear back then, both with WannaCry and NotPetya, is, of course, you only need 1 week part of the chain to get access. So the old notion of basically building sort of a fence around your organization, I think, if nothing else, NotPetya really showed that if you have just 1 weak link, then you can actually penetrate the full organization create chaos and havoc inside. So I think, and you're much more capable of talking about that, but I think sort of the zero trust approach, the new architecture, including the architecture that we are developing at Zscaler, it's just such a different way of looking at it, where you have a multitude of technologies basically reducing the entry points or the threat attack points in organizations in a very dramatic way. And now this is going to sound horrible, and as though I've gone native, just 2 months into the job. But you could ask the question, of course, why on earth hasn't that become, the standard in any organization, that you need to make sure that through policies and technology, you can basically take out any suspicious activity with just one device or one user before that actually gets access to the organization's full IT suite, if you like.
Yeah. No, it's yeah, and certainly it's not just about removing this attack surface or being better at this. But if we look at the impact that it's having on organizations, because of how connected we are, and if you think about critical infrastructure and these types of areas, that now, everything's connected. So
and if we throw in a couple of numbers from our own threat intelligence report, and you know them better than I do. I mean, interestingly enough, we speak a bit about governments, and when you look at year-to-year increase in ransomware attacks, it's almost 50% increase from last year to the report we put out. But then you look at other industries, and that number is actually more dramatic. My favorite, although it's not the right word to use when you talk about something which is so devastating, but if you look at the energy sector, it's a 527% increase year-to-year in the number of ransomware attacks. And I think it just shows, first of all, the complete lack of ethics and moral by those who want to attack us for a variety of reasons. But of course, also shows that those sectors, those industries that are particularly we're paying additional attention to because of the situation with energy, those are increasingly getting the attention, and that is a very, very dramatic, needless to say, increase in the number of ransomware. But I think the point is, there are no industries that will not be impacted by this, and therefore you cannot think that we work in construction, we are a concrete producing company, therefore nobody would be interested in our what we manufacture and what we produce. The honest answer is, today you have a multitude of different attack points and attack spaces, and we might talk a bit about AI later on and what that means in terms of how many different industries you can actually attack simultaneously. So the bottom line is, we need to invest a lot more in this.
Yeah, and it's almost like, I know that if you're a company that's got revenue, there's obviously that aspect that the threat actor says, okay, we're doing this for money, but that's we know that there's always also hacktivists, right? And then we can go into the whole area of nation state, right? Because that's a completely different way of targeting organizations, whether that's governments or healthcare, or then we can get into the whole data topic, right? So I think you're right. Nobody's really safe, whether you're government, financial, and in any of these sectors. But of course, what we see here is that there are a lot of regulations coming. We see NIS2, we see DORA, we see a lot of regulations over here that's now trying to get some level. And hopefully that does help us. What do you think?
Yeah, no, listen, I think, we're sitting in Europe, and although both of us, we cover sort of Europe, Middle East, and Africa, it goes without saying that there's a lot of attention on the regulatory agenda, the legislative agenda of the European Union. And you have this old idea of, you innovate in the US, you copy in Asia or in China, and then you regulate in Europe. I don't think that's completely true anymore, because in fact, we are seeing regulations also emerging around the world for good reasons as well. I think what is a little bit different with the European Union compared to other regions is, of course, the aggregation of different regulations or pieces of legislation that is coming forward simultaneously. So we're a couple of months away from a new European Commission college entering into force with some new names. But if you look at the past Commission for the last 5 years, they have been, I would say, very enthusiastic in developing new regulations across the board on circular economy, on financial institutions, but also on cybersecurity, as you mentioned. I think the overall motive and the idea behind, for example, the NIS2 directive or the Cyber Resilience Act is the right one, which is fundamentally sort of, we need a tide that lifts all ships. We need minimum standards, and we have to make sure, for the same reason we just spoke about, Tony, that even just one weak link somewhere in Europe could have devastating effects for the continent as such. So I think there's a lot of good reasons behind it. I think that the challenge for Europe is, and I'll try and be very politically correct here, not to attract any unintended consequences in this, but I think there are two problems in it. One is it is actually increasingly cumbersome and very burdenful for a lot of companies to live up to these different regulations. So it requires a lot of people, sometimes people with skill sets that are very difficult to get access to because of the shortfall of competences generally in these areas. It's difficult to make sure that you are on the right side of the legislation, because there is an uneven description or translation in the different 27 member states. And with the NIS2 directive, you even have this paradox that in some countries the sort of follow-up at the national level doesn't come out at the same time, and you don't necessarily find yourself facing one single market across the European Union with 27 member states. You in fact look at a 27 market approach, even when it comes to cybersecurity. So I think those are some of the challenges, but the fundamental idea, I think, is the right one. We need to make sure we lift the minimum standards in this area. But if I may just throw the question back to you from a technical point of view, from a technology point of view, I mean, how do you see the NIS2 directive? Is this a game changer for companies? Do they feel that they're forced to do something good? I mean, where are they on this spectrum? Because I know you spoke to a few of them in not too many days ago.
Yeah. So look, I think one of the great things that NIS2 brings is that it's really trying to set that baseline level. And actually even talks about zero trust, and it talks about zero trust in the way it says it's basic hygiene. Yeah. And us in the security world, we've been talking about this forever, right? Just get the basics there, right? I mean, how many times have you heard it? Get your multi-factor in, and these types of things. But now we're saying, hey, zero trust is also basic hygiene. So that means removing the attack surface. I think if there's one thing we can learn from many attacks, whether it's a ransomware attack or nation state, is they need a way in, right?
Yeah.
That is the attack surface.
Yeah.
And if we look at how companies have grown, how we've adopted cloud, how the Internet of Things are connected, I think we had actually just a recent study here on like IoT and OT devices. Yeah. And we found out that 50% of these have operating systems that are end of life.
Yeah.
So that's the attack surface. So many vulnerabilities in these things sitting connected to the internet, and the way we are servicing them. So think about VPN. So we actually, I think, and it's public knowledge that there was an incident here in Denmark around this, right? Where, if you have a VPN concentrator and there's a vulnerability in there, well, yeah, sure, it's great for your service people to come in and remote access this critical infrastructure. Yeah. But I tell you what, that there's a lot of other people that will find that attack surface. They will find that vulnerability, and they will take control of that firewall. So I would always say attack surface is probably number one. And then if I think of, what else can we do around this area, then I think it really is around this notion of assumed breach. So What if my third party is breached? What if I have one user that is infected, one device? Can that spread? What is the lateral movement? Can that get to my crown jewels? And if we're able to really take those two, reduce attack surface and reduce the lateral movement, I think we're gonna win this. Yeah, I'm trying to be an optimist in this, and sometimes it's hard in our industry, right? When we read all these stats and we say, are we winning? We actually had I had an event with about 50 CISOs, and there was a question: are we winning? do we think that we're actually winning this? So how many do you think believe we're winning?
Listen, I think it would be a huge problem if you were to get up with so many CISOs and they said, no, we're losing, because that's sort of a fundamental way of getting themselves out of it. But, what is it, 50-50?
Only one CISO raised their hand that we're winning this.
Yeah.
Right? It's a
it's a pessimistic group of people. I mean, it's like diplomats. They fundamentally don't believe in good things or in optimism.
So actually, I think we need to change that, right? I think we need to be optimistic, because I think we are starting to see tools, and you talked a little bit about AI. Well, the adversaries, of course, they're going to adopt AI, of course, and we already see that. But then we also need to adopt AI. We need to use that against them. So I think I think as they, it's like a chess game. If they take a move, we need to take another couple of moves, right? So it's never gonna. That's the problem. It's never gonna stop. But I think if we fundamentally change architecture and we fundamentally change some of the ways we're doing things, I actually think we can win here.
And I think that's such an important nuance, if you like, Tony, because I think there is this tendency among especially decision makers to basically believe that AI is the solution to all our problems when it comes to cyber attacks, etc. And I think just getting a little bit of realism in there and saying, it can actually also be used by those who do not want us well, and those who would like to get access to our data sets or be destructive vis-a-vis organizations, etc. It's a pretty powerful tool in their hands as well, not least in creating scale, in creating a multitude of attack points that are basically overflowing our system. So I think this sort of arms race approach is going to be incredibly important. But I think the flip side of the coin is, when it comes to technology application and innovation, malign actors are pretty efficient in getting those new technologies rolled out, and therefore it would be an enormous mistake if governments, private sector organizations do not invest massively also in making sure that AI is going to be used also in mitigating the threats from the outset. So I think this arms race calls for early adaptation and use of AI systems also in terms of how we provide defensive security architecture as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually heard if you think about our generation, right, that we've lived through this generation of going from not being online, there was no internet, right, to we're all connected, right? So we've actually lived through this amazing transformation, but we're now heading into another transformation with AI that, I think will be even bigger than what we've seen with the revolution of the internet, right? And that's a pretty, if you start to think and take a step back from it and think about where we're going to be in 20 years, what are my kids going to be doing in 20, 30, 40 years, right? It's super interesting, I think, the whole AI topic. Of course, there's a lot of hype around it at the moment, but we always will see that. We will see a lot of hype, and, it's a little bit like the Gartner hype curve, right? It'll come up, but then we will see that trough, and then we'll actually, over the long period, I think, see where AI is really making a huge difference. And of course, there's no doubt that it will be used everywhere.
For us and against us.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
exactly. Although I think you're spot on here, but I am fairly upset that you managed to pull in our age and actually illustrate to everybody listening in that we've been through a different kind of technology development. I try and hide my age, but thanks very much for that, Tony.
No problems at all. So if we look and we keep on the topic of AI, one of the things I'm hearing a lot about is, now we have this AI Act, and there was also a report, the DIGE report, as they call it, right? And I think there's a lot of concern. Actually, I saw this. I don't know if you saw this recently, but there's a picture of the US versus the EU innovation, right? And there was in the US, it was the Elon Musk rocket landing,
Yes.
innovation. And then it said innovation here, and it had the bottle cap.
Yep.
I don't know if you saw that one, but then I was thinking, now, are we sort of falling behind on the innovation? And, is the AI Act gonna, is it
Add
gonna
to the
slow down?
trouble.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no. So I think the Draghi report, sort of the former head of the European Central Bank and Italian politician, has been quite impactful. Perhaps you could argue that it comes a little bit late because it paints a pretty gloomy picture of how Europe is doing on a global scale. I mean, one of my favorite examples is that when you look at the single market in the European Union, when that was sort of invented back in 1993. And we can use Italy as the example because of Mario Draghi. The size of the Italian economy was larger than that of China and India combined together. I mean, it's again, you and I would probably be able to remember a few things back in 1993. It's not that long ago. And can you imagine what kind of different world that we're looking at? It's such a different world for Europe, where Europe's part of the global economy has basically been reduced. And I think what Draghi is pointing out is sort of 2 or 3 points, but let's focus on 2 of them. One is, European competitiveness is not where it should be. We're losing towards US companies, towards companies from Asia. And the second thing is, of course, pointing out that when it comes to technology, Europe is trailing behind quite dramatically. We don't scale the number of unicorns that we should. I think one of the statistics that Draghi has in the report is that when you look at the 50 largest, technology companies in the world, 4 of them at the maximum comes from Europe. The rest comes primarily from the US and from Asia, from China. Those are numbers that I think, causes or should cause a lot of concern among European decision makers. And you're an honorary European, although you have a background from the Pacific area. But I think for those of us that are in Europe, although we work for an American company, I think we have to acknowledge that these are difficult times. And I would even sort of lift it up to say this is not only about economic growth or about job creation. It's also about, protecting, Western democracies, the institutions we have. That is also what is at stake here. And I think that's one of the reasons, Tony, that you have this big discussion in Europe around digital sovereignty. How do we make sure that, you can be in control? And how can we make sure that whether you're a government or a private company, that you can rest assured that your data sets will remain your data sets, that then they will not be utilized for bad things or for old school industrial espionage. Those are discussions that are ongoing. And then if I become a little bit emotional here towards the end of the podcast, I mean, one of the reasons I also chose to join Zscaler is, integrity matters, and it matters a whole lot to me as well. And I actually think the technology that we use, privacy by design, security by design, we do not keep the data sets of our customers. We don't utilize it. We don't monetize it. I think in many ways, what we can do in Zscaler is to provide technology that can deliver on digital sovereignty, because you give control back. And you can call that a European phenomenon. I would argue that I don't think it is a European phenomenon. I think you see the same discussions in Latin America. You see it in Asia, in India, the Pacific area, who do not want to be in control. So I think that's going to be one of the biggest issues moving in. And I think it's an incredible opportunity, but also, frankly speaking, responsibility for companies to help Europe make it in the digital age. And then hopefully the next European Commission will focus a little bit more on what needs to happen in terms of policies, and perhaps fewer regulations and more consistent implementation of the regulations that are already out there.
Yeah, I know. Absolutely. You bring up a fantastic point, right? Because if you think about Zscaler and when we started, I mean, we started also in EMEA at the same time, right? So it wasn't a CEO didn't want to do a startup in the US, build the business out. We wanted to build a global business, right? From day one. And that's why 50% of our business is outside of the US. And of course, as a CISO and resident at Zscaler, what's one of the big questions we always get asked is, what about privacy? Because it is important. It is important for customers. And it's something that I've probably clarified 100 times here. And and it's so nice that I can clarify, hey, we do this by design. The way we architect the cloud, the way we run everything in memory. So nothing is ever written to disk. Yeah. Exactly. And the data that we do keep is just transactional logs. And if you want to keep those here in the EU, no problems. we'll keep them here, right? If you want to keep them private in your data center, we'll even give you the option for that, right? But really respecting that companies, they want to make sure, know where their data is. And of course, that's one aspect from operating a cloud. But then I think more importantly, and one of the discussions I have with every CISO at the moment, is how are you protecting my data in my corporation? How do you make sure that data isn't being leaked to a nation state, or the data going towards a ransomware gang where they want to use that against you, right? I mean, that's across the board. There's probably not a conversation I don't have with a CISO that doesn't come up with how can you protect my data?
Exactly. And this, I mean, I'm literally just back from Singapore International Cyber Week. So this is not a European phenomenon or an EMEA phenomenon. It's something that happened in Southeast Asia. And if I had to sort of condense some of the impressions from those discussions that took place among a lot of companies, among a lot of governments, it is really an increased focus on what I would call sovereign cloud solutions, that, the ability to operate with the cloud, which of course is absolutely necessary, but do that in a way where you are in control, where you have full authority over it. And I think that is something which is going to see an increased attention, both from government, but it's governments, from the fact also from the private sector. And there are many different versions of it, but fundamentally, I would say that you can define that as being absolutely sure that your data sets will not go anywhere, either for commercial reasons or for intelligence reasons. And I think that will be an increased challenge for all of us working in the technology industry to help provide that technology in a way that is safe, secure, that really gives that kind of trust and confidence back to the users, that they can use new technology in a way that is very trustable. And I think the lack of that, Tony, will actually be the biggest hindrance in taking innovation and new technology forward, and thereby indirectly also reducing our mitigation of the threats we're seeing from a cybersecurity point of view. So I think things fit together, and it's going to be one of the big challenges in the next couple of months and years, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I think we could talk all day about data and all these sorts of topics. But I think I think you said it very well, in that, and this goes across for any organization, for any cloud provider, but that privacy by design. Right? That needs to be architected into the things we build. And it doesn't matter what we're building. We always have to sort of think about privacy by design. And it's, of course, secure by design. Right? We talked about OT and critical infrastructure. So it's not just up to us here, but it's up to everyone in the industry, whether you're building the OT devices or whether it's us trying to protect them and remove that attack surface. But I think there's a lot we can do. And, I know we've given a lot of stats today around the gloomy stats, right? You talked about energy, and was that 527%? Yeah. I'm glad the power's still on here, right?
But Tony, as somebody who spent most of my career working in governments and the NATO and the European Union, if there's anything I learned from those years working in the public sector, is that there's nothing that can drive change as much as fear. So in that sense, it is good to use a few statistics here and there. And, I'm just happy that somebody with a political background would be able to have a podcast conversation with you and not make a complete fool of himself. And I learn every time I speak to you as well. So thanks a lot for that, Tony.
No. I think it was that Winston Churchill said, right? Don't let a good crisis go to waste. Yeah,
that's right.
So I've seen that in many organizations, right? If you've had a breach, sometimes that is how you need to leverage to transform, right?
Totally.
And, so I think, I think we can think positively about the future. I like to say I'm an optimist. I think we can do the right things. I think if we have the right architecture, privacy by design, secure by design, if we do some of those things, let's hope we can, win this battle.
I think we need to.
Yeah. Look, Casper, I think we're out of time. So want to thank you for today for the great discussion. And thank you to all the listeners. And tune in next time. Take care.
Thanks, Tony.
You've been listening to the CISO's Gambit,
I'm your host, Sean Cordeiro. Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed this show, please leave a comment and subscribe.
Content on this podcast may contain forward-looking statements that are current as of the date of recording and subject to change. These statements are subject to the safe harbor provisions created by the Private Securities Litigation Reform Act of 1995. Full legal disclaimers are available at revolutionaries.zscaler.com.
Copyright 2022.